Hello and welcome to this guide on how to make a cage for your action figure ring. I've had loads of requests of people asking how I made my cages. They're really easy to make and not too expensive as well. You'll need a few pretty straightforward things. You'll need some wooden dowel, a ruler or perhaps tape measure, something to measure anyway, some super glue, some florist wire, and all importantly, some modelling mesh, which you can get on eBay. That's where I got mine, in coarse, medium or fine. Not too expensive, relatively anyway, for what we're going to end up with. Now the method I'm going to show you can be used for any size cage, for any sized ring. I'll quickly show you my Hasbro cage, which was something of a learning experience. I cut these panels individually, so this is 2 panels, and I bought some steel rods, which are relatively expensive, took ages to come, and then really fiddly to stick the thing together. I experimented with all sorts of different glue. I ended up with patches of glue everywhere. I've got the rods coming away. It wasn't an overall success, but it's a finished product. However, with the Jax cage that I made, I found a much more straightforward method which can now be used for Hasbro and any size, which I'll tell you about. You will notice with the Hasbro cage, the door opens the wrong way. Has to, of course, because of the nature of the Hasbro steps. Let's move on to my Jax cage and the method that should be useful for any cage you want to make. And now onto my Jax cage. I use the Jax real scale ring, but this method, as I say, will work on any size ring, any scale of figures. And the first thing you want to do is to measure and cut your modelling mesh to build the sides of your cage. The lesson I learned from my Hasbro cage is just to cut 4 big panels, one for each side of the ring, and then to make it look like there are more panels with the dowel placing, which I'll get onto later. In terms of measurements, I went for 21.5 inches across my cage. I measured from the point of the posts so that my cage meets outside the post. It doesn't really matter if the measurement's not exactly right, because once you've tied it together and hung it on the ring, it doesn't matter if there's a little bit of space around it. It's 12 inches high, and the door, I just got a figure, decided that's about how big I wanted it, and it's 10 inches from frame to frame. You will probably notice that actually the scale of my cage is much bigger than you tend to see in real life. And that's because I wanted something with a good scale that looked really good in photographs. You remember the old NWA cage often just sort of grazed the top of the wrestlers' heads. I did try tin snips and all different sorts of things to cut the cage. Actually, the modelling mesh is really soft, and I found the best thing was just old-fashioned kitchen scissors. Doesn't do the scissors much good, but it does work a treat. The next thing we're going to do is cut the door, very similar to cutting the side panels. Decide how big you want it, where you want it, and then we're going to cut a piece out completely. And then we're going to take it away, we're going to build a frame with dowel, and we're going to stick it back on a bit later on. Try and cut nicely and straight along the edges, therefore you maintain this diamond pattern so that when you put it back together, you get a sort of continuity of the mesh. There's no mesh down here. You'll see I've taken my door all the way to the bottom. There is a little bit left on this side after I've taken my panel out. That just means I've got something left to attach this dowel to, which makes it a bit easier to put together. Doesn't really matter where you put it, probably should be over that side, but I've put mine on this side. The next thing we want to do is to create the frame or support beams for our cage. Now, you can use steel rods or metal of some sort if you wish. I found, as with my Hasbro ring, that was more expensive, quite fiddly and quite difficult to fix together. The easiest and cheapest, simplest option in terms of putting it together is to use wooden dowel painted. Now that will vary depending on the size and scale of figures and ring that you're using, but for my Mattel and Jax figures, I used 6mm dowel, cut it to size to measure along the edges of my cage, I chose to use one support beam down the middle to create these two panels. You may want to put a couple more in to create more panels, or maybe some struts across here, depending on the style and design of cage that you want to create. Then I'm a big believer in doing things as cheap as possible. I just got some primer, some undercoat, painted my wooden dowel, and then I had a metallic water-based paint tester pot that I used, put over the top to give it that metallic look, and then I varnished it to give it that final sheen and to keep the paint on. Now, the one danger of putting varnish over the top of paint, you may know, is a slight yellowing effect. You may want to get a specific paint, specific metallic paint for wood, or indeed you could try using Mod Podge, which is great for action figures and I'm sure would work just as well for this. Now, once you've painted your dowel, the next thing to do is to attach it to your modelling mesh to create your cage panels, which could be a bit of a fiddly process, but is actually very straightforward. And that is where the florist wire comes into play. You could use any sort of wire, but I use florist wire. One, because it's cheap. There's definitely a theme in how I put my cages and my custom things together. Secondly, it's very thin, so you can't really see it in the finished product. And it's malleable, so when you're trying to tie it together and bend it round, it bends really easily. What I do is I lay my mesh panels down flat, put my dowel where I want them along the edges, and then you just tie them on. Just simply use a bit of florist wire and tie it in place. Then go along with the super glue and just glue at different intervals, just where perhaps the cage is coming away slightly, or maybe the cage is slightly bent. Just glue it along the edges. The wire will hold it in place and it will dry and you'll have a really strong frame. The other thing is it is quite sharp, not necessarily child friendly, and gluing it tends to just take some of those sharp edges away because they're stuck onto the dowel. Exactly the same with the frame around the door, tying it on with florist wire and gluing it, and indeed with the door, with your individual panel that we cut earlier, we're going to tie on the dowel round that frame, glue it together, and you've got a door which you can then attach to your main cage. Very simply, again, the florist wire, like sort of hinges, I've tied it on there and that swings nicely open. The only thing is, a bit like real hinges, if you do it too tight, which I think I probably have, then the door doesn't shut quite. So you probably want to just leave that slightly looser than I have. And again, a bit of florist wire could be used to shut the door. Also, really useful florist wire for actually hanging the cage. I always put a piece into each panel and hang it over the bottom turnbuckle and then tie it up there, and then a piece in the top corner, twisted, tied together, and it creates a nice solid frame, and you'd be surprised how much weight it can take as well. Now, I've left that out there because I wanted to show you, but generally speaking, I cut it off or tuck it in, and when you do that, it hides away nicely and you can't really see it. And there you have your very own cage. In summary then, you're going to cut your modelling mesh to the size and dimensions you want for your ring. I use kitchen scissors because of the softness of the mesh. That seems to work. The next thing we're going to do is measure and cut our dowel so that it goes along the edges of our cage panels, and then we're going to put some primer, some undercoat, some white paint on it, and then put our metallic paint over the top, and then you can seal it as well if you want, like me, just to make sure the paint doesn't come off. And then from there, to coin a phrase, we're going to attach our dowel, which will be painted to our modelling mesh using florist wire. We're simply going to go along, we're going to give it a twist, and we're going to tie the two together. Then go along with our super glue. We'll have our florist wire keeping things in place, and then where there are just a few gaps, we're going to go along and we're going to glue with our super glue, closing up those gaps. It should dry clear. I'll just give you a slightly stronger, slightly more solid frame. And in one corner of one of your panels, you're going to cut out a door to the size and dimensions you want. We're going to do exactly the same with our dowel and our florist wire and our glue to create a frame for our door and a frame for our cage. And then we're going to use florist wire to attach the door, and you should have your completed cage to use with your action figures.